Good afternoon. My name is Glenn Dubin, COO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this last in a series of webinars on the upcoming Israeli elections. Israeli voters are going back to the polls on March 23rd for the fourth time in 2 years. What's at stake in this election? What are the unique dynamics of this election cycle held in the wake of a highly successful vaccination effort? And what are the polls saying about the likely winners and losers? JCPA is pleased to be bringing this timely and important discussion to you. The Jewish Council for Public Affairs is the network hub of the Jewish Community Relations Network, representing 125 local JCRCs and 16 national organizations, and we come together to grapple with the pressing issues of the day. If you find this program informative, please consider supporting our work by making a donation to JCPA. For more information, please visit our website, jewishpublicaffairs.org. Also, we want to make you aware of our annual conference, this year virtual, scheduled from April 25th and 26th. Visit our website for more information, again, jewishpublicaffairs.org. Today's moderator is Linda Scherzer. Linda Scherzer is the JCRC Director for the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West and also a former CNN Jerusalem correspondent. Linda, thank you for moderating today. It's a pleasure to have you, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Glenn, and good afternoon, everyone. My thanks to JCPA, to Melanie, Chaya, Glenn for putting this webinar together. I'm delighted to serve as moderator. So here we go again, hoping that the fourth time is a charm, but prepared for more political deadlock. We know that the sands have shifted in the Israeli political space. Key parties have realigned. One important new party on the right has emerged. Key players who were once kingmakers are no longer in the same position. New players have emerged, solidifying the country's march to the right. And then, of course, there is Benjamin Netanyahu, seeking another term as prime minister after governing for 12 years, facing charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, a country and his own right wing deeply divided about his continuing leadership. So is this really a referendum on him? In many ways, Israel seems to have it so together, leading the world on the rollout of the vaccine, the Abraham Accords ushering a new era of normalization and the possibility of a new Middle East, certainly with the countries that they have made peace with, the longest period of relative calm that I can remember, and yet there is ongoing instability in the body politic. It's all rather confusing, exasperating even, especially for an American audience frankly distracted by our own political drama, not to mention the rollout of the corona vaccine here. As my friend and colleague Gary Rosenblatt, the former editor and publisher of the Jewish Week of New York, wrote last week in his new blog, we've just gone through our own political trauma here in the United States, absorbed and fatigued by the general election and its aftermath. The title of Gary's piece was, Israel nears its most faithful elections, American Jews could care less. Of course, the title is somewhat tongue-in-cheek. Gary knows, as I do, that many of us do care a lot about the future of Israel, the direction the country will be going in the aftermath of this election, and of course, the US-Israel relationship. With us to sort all of this out are two leading Israeli journalists, Lahav Harkov, diplomatic correspondent and senior contributing editor of the Jerusalem Post, and Haviv Redigur, senior analyst for the Times of Israel. Lahav and Haviv are each going to give opening remarks for about 10 minutes, followed by a moderated conversation with me and of course Q&A with you. So we ask you to please put those questions into the chat function. We will try to get to as many as we can. Now, excuse me, as I turn to our journalists, I ask them these kind of overarching questions, framing it this way. Why is this happening again, a fourth time, beyond the fact that the Knesset failed, as we know, to pass a state budget in December, triggering these elections? And as a follow-up, since there don't seem to be any major policy differences or disagreements, what are Israelis actually voting for? Lahav, we're going to start with you. The floor is yours.
everyone. Really cool. Why does this keep happening is sort of the $1 million question. I think the big answer is that it's happening because of Netanyahu in a way, but it's also because of the way people respond to Netanyahu. So Netanyahu is a very polarizing figure. People tend to either love him or hate him. People, for the most part, no longer have to be resigned to him because there are other right-wing parties that, you put them under a microscope and you could barely tell the difference between them, other than the fact that Netanyahu is the head of Likud and Gideon Sa'ar, for example, a former senior Likud minister, is the head of the New Hope party that broke away from Likud. But Netanyahu, basically every election since 2009 has been a referendum on, yes, Bibi or no Bibi. And it's become more and more like that over time, and especially in this sort of 4 election cycle. And in this election, they're racially divided over the yes, Bibi, no Bibi question. Is now still, if you look at the Israeli right, and in Israel, when you talk about right or left, the definitions tend to refer to how people feel about solution or how to move forward in the conflict with the Palestinians, whereas the further you get to the right, the fewer concessions people want to make as far as land is concerned. They oppose a Palestinian state. And the further you get to the left, the more people want to move to pre-1967 lines and want a 2-state solution. The interesting thing is that even though those are the general definitions of right and left in Israel, in other ways, sort of socially, economically, they somewhat track with other parts of the world and other countries' definitions of right and left, not perfectly, but to a great extent. But what's interesting about the fact that sort of left and right tend to be defined by how they view the land of Israel is that those issues are not on the agenda at all in this election. So, I think there's the yes, Bibi, no Bibi factor, as I said. And then if we're talking about actual issues, the coronavirus response was a big one for a while. In the beginning of this election cycle, Israel went into a lockdown of over a month. But during that lockdown, Israel was vaccinating people in record numbers. The vast majority of Israeli adults are now vaccinated. And as of about a week ago, almost everything has reopened. You could go to the gym, you can go shopping in the mall, you can go to restaurants. And Israelis, I think, are very quickly settling into sort of the new routine where things are mostly normal, except you have to wear a mask everywhere. And so you see the dialogue shifting too, where in the beginning people were saying, this government is handling coronavirus really badly, because there were sort of 2 things happening at once, right? Like Netanyahu was very successful at bringing these vaccines to Israel. The CEO of Pfizer said in an interview, a recent interview with the Israeli media, that Netanyahu was obsessed. Netanyahu called him 30 times. So you got to give Netanyahu credit for this, even though the rollout would not have been so successful if Israel didn't have such a great and efficient health system. So anyway, we have the successful vaccine rollout, but at the same time, we had 3 lockdowns. We had a very chaotic, sort of constantly changing policies. What's open? What's closed? Can Israelis who are outside the country fly in or not? There were a lot of leaks coming out of cabinet meetings of them being completely chaotic and disastrous and just shouting matches, which is typical of Israeli politics. But, you'd like to think that maybe these serious issues of coronavirus are being handled a little better. But the vaccine thing and being able to reopen the country has sort of scuttled that whole conversation. And now politicians are looking for something else to talk about. And so there's not a core issue really that I think in these days before the election that you could say, oh, this is what it's going to be about. But it's definitely not about security issues or the 2-state solution, which is, of course, unusual. It's not the first time, but it's unusual for Israeli elections. If we go back, notice, the 2 issues, of course. There's the policy issues. There are the people who really don't agree with Netanyahu on a lot of policy issues, whether it's the Palestinians, whether it's the fact that he's really for a free market economy, even though he's not been super effective at promoting it in more recent years because of his coalition partners, especially the ultra-Orthodox. But the people oppose him on those kinds of grounds, or they oppose him because he always builds or almost always builds his coalition with the ultra-Orthodox and therefore is not willing to budge on issues of religion and state. And the Haredim and the ultra-Orthodox continue to get sort of all kinds of benefits and exceptions from things compared to the secular. So it's just this sort of visceral feeling that people have about him, that some people like him, some people dislike him. And of course, there's the issue that Israeli law allows a prime minister to stay in office while he's on trial for corruption. And the law only requires him to leave if he's, as I'm sure you all know, Netanyahu is on trial. There are 3 different corruption cases against him. In my opinion, they're of varying seriousness. I'm not a lawyer, but some it seems sort of more serious than others, and we'll see if he's convicted or not. I'd be surprised if he's convicted on all 3. I'll say that much. But either way, there's sort of a values thing there, where some people say just because the law, has this limit, doesn't mean that it's, as far as our principles and our values are concerned, is the right thing to do, and we can't support a prime minister like this. And that's where Gideon Sa'ar, who I mentioned before, comes in. He split off from Likud with several other Knesset members from Likud and other people sort of from the moderate right that were outside Likud, and formed a party called New Hope. Now, at the beginning of the election, people thought that this was going to be sort of that the sort of main contender to replace Netanyahu would be Gideon Sa'ar. But over time, that's not what's happened. Sa'ar is, honestly, he's just not the most charismatic candidate. I think he's a very talented sort of parliamentarian and minister. He's very effective. He gets a lot of things done. But he's proven not to be such a great campaigner. And he's not someone who will, sway you with a powerful speech the way Netanyahu is known to be able to do. And honestly, the way Yair Lapid, the leader of the Yesh Atid party, which is, at the moment he's opposition leader, and now in the polls he's the biggest sort of party after Likud. He is also quite charismatic, and he was a TV personality before he entered politics, an anchorman and a talk show host. So Sa'ar's not doing very well. He's clearly getting some not such great hated competition to Netanyahu. Yair Lapid, as I just mentioned, the former TV star, charismatic speaker, and he's more of a centrist. And honestly, people talk about the Israeli left dying. The number of people who call themselves left in Israel is dwindling, but Yesh Atid in many ways is comparable to what were sort of the moderate members of the Labor Party before that, even comparable to, Bougie Herzog, who was opposition leader a few years ago. I don't think that they're in any truly significant way much to the right of the sort of moderate part of the Labor Party. It's just that the Labor Party right now is very much leaning into its left wing. So in any case, the issue is that Lapid, there's a numbers game, and I know that Haviv is going to show you some kind of chart. So I'll just say, Lapid is sort of the leader of the anti-Bibi side of things. It's hard to see him having the numbers to build a coalition that could bring Netanyahu down, partly just because of the raw numbers, partly because some of the members of that anti-Bibi side are in the joint list, and Ra'am, which are the main Arab parties. And it's not about them being Arabs per se, because there are Arabs in several other parties, including Likud, Labor, Meretz. I think that's it, but there might be others. It's about them opposing Israel as a Jewish state, and they ideologically don't necessarily want to be in the government, although there are some shifts in that. But because they sort of oppose Israel as the Jewish state, and some of them identify with some of the really extreme groups among the Palestinians, people don't want to sit with them in a coalition. And so even though it's so clear that Netanyahu will have a majority coalition, it's also not so clear that the anti-Netanyahu coalition will win. And so I think that there is a good chance that we're going to have a fifth election, unless there's a very big election surprise. One of the biggest pollsters in Israel just said on TV like about an hour ago that there's a very large number of undecided Israelis, and so there may be surprises on election day. We'll have to wait and see.
Okay, great. Lahav, thank you so much for that. So we're going to turn to Haviv, who I think is going to share with us some numbers and what a potential coalition could look like after the dust settles on March 23rd. Haviv?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to make just a couple of quick comments and then switch over, share my screen, which is just a little slide of a poll we had from a couple days ago. And I want to very, very quickly walk us through some of the really, really complicated and I think interesting ways. And some of this is ground that I'm going to skip over because Lahav covered quite a bit, and we're going to try and get straight to the sort of calculus and the chaos math that us pundits are dealing with in the run up to the election in the next 8 days. I want to make a couple of sort of significant comments and then look at the Israeli voter in the context of a poll. So we'll get to it. First of all, what's fascinating about this election is that so much has changed from the last three that we've had over the last 2 years, and yet the fundamentals never changed. We have the blue and white alliance, which was 30 seats, 33 seats, 35 seats. An enormous coalition has evaporated. It broke apart when Benny Gantz agreed to start negotiating the unity government back in March a year ago. Gideon Sa'ar and Naftali Bennett are making these surprising runs at leading right-wing parties that are opposed to Netanyahu. Bennett sort of running openly and critically of Netanyahu, not actually vowing not to sit with him, but saying that Netanyahu has done terrible damage to the country with his handling of the pandemic and other issues. And Sa'ar actually promising that he will not sit with Netanyahu, and if you want him to sit with Netanyahu, please don't vote for him, right? Saying it just outright, making that the premise of his run. We haven't seen anti-Netanyahu right-wing parties except Avigdor Lieberman over the last 2 years, but Avigdor Lieberman never left the 5 to 7 seat range. Now it's a quarter of parliament, or at least in polls, or 25 seats at least. We have, of course, the pandemic, COVID, the government's failures, the mismanagement, the tremendous success of the vaccination campaign, which was already mentioned. It's a real roller coaster. It's a real, topsy-turvy. We've had a year now of just embarrassing and frustrating political deadlock. It's hard to see this outside of Israel, but I'm a parent to Israeli school children. And I can tell you that up until 3 days after the start of the school year in September, 3 days after the start of the school year, we did not know if the school year was starting properly. And so the first month of school, for example, the school my kids go to didn't have the budget for the first month because it just didn't run through the Knesset in time for the after-school programs and for the youth at risk programs and for the special education programs. And so those kids just didn't have programs for a month, and all of it is just because of management. Netanyahu, for political reasons, with Benny Gantz in the rotation, wouldn't pass a state budget. There's a railroad they're building to Eilat that's going to fundamentally change the condition of the city of Eilat. For 2 years, that railroad has not been built because there is no state budget passed. All of the funding for the state throughout this pandemic has been in these stopgap bills. People have been terribly hurt, especially the most vulnerable Israelis. All of that is the Netanyahu government's lack of capacity to function. The dislike of Netanyahu. It can be easy from overseas to look at Israel, say, look at this astounding, vaccine program. How could anybody be angry at Netanyahu? And the answer is that there are tremendous numbers of Israelis hurt by the profound dysfunction of the government of the last year. That's different. That's new. The Arab vote is splitting. We saw that with Ram pulling out of the joint list and saying, guys, we got to stop standing on principle and having our ideology and being angry at Netanyahu and the right and actually tackle the kind of coalition wheeling and dealing that delivers real state budgets and ends the neglect that Arab communities have faced. And therefore, I will also work with Netanyahu. And if you don't want that, don't vote for me. That's what I'm running on. The Ram party led by Mansour Abbas has said. All of these things are changes. They're fundamental changes, and they're all over the last year. And yet Netanyahu's coalition, the people saying they're going to back Netanyahu, is at exactly the same overall place of something like 58 to 60 seats, depending on polls, as it was for the last 2 years in those 3 elections. So somehow everything can change, and the fundamentals of are you for Netanyahu or against Netanyahu, of the parties and of the voters, is motionless, is just stuck at this deadlock. To me, that's fascinating. I want to also say many people expect that we're going to go to a 5th election for that reason. And I mean many. I mean, the number 2 in the United Torah Judaism Party, Yaakov Litzman, said that today in a speech. We're going to a 5th election. I don't see how we form a government. There's no pundit who doesn't think that that's a very possibility that we should be prepared for. And the final thing is, before I get to the poll, whoever does win won't enjoy their victory very much. If Netanyahu manages to squeak out 61 seats, 62 seats in the 120-seat Knesset, he's going to have a government utterly dependent for everything, for every vote in the parliament, for the budget, for everything. He's going to have a government dependent on the most right-wing factions in the Knesset, including Itamar Ben-Gvir of the Kahanist Otzma Yehudit party that Netanyahu has helped usher in to the Knesset in this desperate attempt to break through this maddening glass ceiling that he's faced over the last 2 years. It'll be a 61, 62 seat coalition dependent on the most extreme factions in the parliament. The other side of the aisle, we're talking about a coalition to oust Netanyahu. If they actually try to form a coalition, it'll be a coalition with Labor and Meretz on the left, with Gideon Sa'ar and Naftali Bennett on the right. Again, impossible, unstable, without policy coherence. The best case scenario of victory is very Pyrrhic victory. So if you're frustrated, if you're worried, welcome to Israel. Welcome to our discussions in Israel. And now I want to share my screen, which I definitely know how to do. There we go. And there we go, share. Does everybody see that? Do you see the slideshow? Okay, I don't even have another thing. So even if you don't see it as a slideshow, it's fine. This is a Khan public broadcaster poll from yesterday. I actually have to double check. It might have been broadcast Friday. I apologize. I just had on my desk 4 polls. They all show the same thing, so we're just going to go with it. This is a poll by the Khan Public Broadcaster. Now, there are a lot of numbers on this screen. I'm not going to walk you through them. I'm going to just mention the one important significant point. And the one important significant point is the final reason that this election is deeply frustrating is that can you hear me?
Haviv, you're freezing up a little bit. Can you go back over the last 30 seconds of what you were telling us? And we do see the screen.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I keep talking. We no longer see your screen, but I think you're now.
Okay, I think the sharing was a problem. So I'm going to ignore the sharing, and I'm just going to tell you what it said. Or maybe I can copy paste it into the chat. Let's just talk. One of our big problems is the Israeli voter. Israeli voters are very as Lahav mentioned, the parties that are close to the threshold, right? There are 4 parties that are hovering around the threshold, climbing 1 seat above 1 week and then dropping half a percentage point below another week. And those parties are the right-wing religious Zionism, Benny Gantz's Blue and White, and Meretz on the left. And depending on which party drops below the threshold, the whole election tilts in the other direction. And so it's an election that could be decided by the 0.5 percentage point loss to some very, very minor eclectic party all the way at the bottom of the list of parties. That's how close the race is and how hard it is to predict what's going to happen. The other reason that it's hard to predict what's going to happen in this dramatic, and what do I mean by that? I mean that they're extremely tactical. They watch the polls leading into election day, especially very closely watching polls now, and Israeli voters we know are going to respond to the polls in making their own decisions. And so it's a little bit like quantum physics. Watching by polling Israeli voters, you're changing Israeli voters. Observing their views changes their views. And I will try to walk you through that without the numbers in front of you. According to the polling today, Netanyahu has roughly 58 to 61 seats, depending on polls and depending on which small parties fall below the threshold. And the opposite side, the anti-Netanyahu camp, has the same. Let's say a voter for the Sa'al party called New Hope, right? Now, this is the right-wing anti-Netanyahu party. We're going to go a tiny bit into the weeds for 3 minutes, and I think it will provide us with something valuable. Why would someone now, Gideon Sa'ar was polling at 20 seats a month ago. Yair Lapid of the Yesh Atid party, who's also the head of the opposition in the Knesset right now, Yair Lapid was polling at 14, much lower. Gideon Sa'ar today has dropped to 11 seats, and in some polls even 9, and Yair Lapid has soared to 19, 20, even 21 seats. Gideon Sa'ar and Yair Lapid have flipped sides. Now, Lapid wants to oust Netanyahu. Sa'ar wants to oust Netanyahu. Why would someone vote for a right-winger like Sa'al vowing to oust Netanyahu when he's now polling at 10 seats and can't oust Netanyahu, right? So there are 3 kinds of voters who now vote for Sa'al. And the reason it's interesting, Sa'al, because there are 3 kinds of voters voting for Sa'al, and they are the 3 kinds of voters generally in an Israeli election, and they're worth talking about. One kind of voter, the first kind of voter, is a voter who thinks that Gideon Sa'ar is a good man, that the substance of his, maybe a conservative voter, Gideon Sa'ar is a conservative. Gideon Sa'ar also doesn't campaign negative campaigns. He doesn't say mean things about minorities. He doesn't have a lot of the baggage that Benjamin Netanyahu brings with him. He was a competent minister in various governments. And for reasons of character, of substance, kind of intuitively, you can support the man. I can imagine such a voter for Gideon Sa'ar, and some voters don't vote tactically. They vote just on the person. Then there's the tactical Israeli voter, and these are double-digit percentages of Israeli voters. And the tactical Israeli voters for Gideon Sa'ar, who I have spoken to, say the following. There are 3 major parties trying to cobble together a coalition against Netanyahu: Lapid, Bennett, and Sa'ar. Lapid is the largest party. Bennett and Sa'ar are believed to be planning, believed but deny, to be planning after election day to unite their 2 right-wing, non-supporting Netanyahu parties into a single faction to make sure that they're larger than Lapid the day after the election, so that when the anti-Netanyahu coalition forms, they're the largest faction and they get to have the prime minister's chair in the anti-Netanyahu coalition. To vote Gideon Sa'ar, even at 10 or 11 seats, you could still be selecting a prime minister if Gideon Sa'ar manages to get to election day 1 seat larger than Bennett, which places him at the top of the joint Bennett-Sa'ar faction after election day, which places the joint faction, if it's he only has to be 1 seat larger than Bennett. Bennett-Sa'ar together only have to be 1 seat larger than Lapid, and then Sa'ar sits on top of the entire 61, 62 seat anti-Netanyahu coalition that forms, and Gideon Sa'ar is prime minister. There is a tactical Israeli voter who doesn't have to carry Gideon Sa'ar all the way to 20 seats or 30 seats to beat Netanyahu. He only really has to carry Gideon Sa'ar to somewhere around the 12 seats, while Bennett is 11, right? And that's accessible, and so they vote for Sa'ar. And then there's the third voter, and I want to just take 10 seconds on the third voter, and then my time is done. The third kind of voter is not just tactical. The third kind of Israeli voter is a kind of uber tactical, is uber tactical, the uber tactical voter. Imagine a conservative who likes Gideon Sa'ar for the reasons we mentioned at the beginning, character, policy, whatever. That conservative has two choices. And those two choices reflect the coalition nature of Israeli governments. Benjamin Netanyahu's best hope in this election is a narrow government in which he has to cater to very, very extreme factions that in the past he has worked very hard to keep out of the Knesset. Itamar Ben-Gvir and Otzma Yehudit, namely. And on the other hand, you have Yair Lapid, who cannot form a government without Gideon Sa'ar and Bennett. And so as, let's call it a center-right sort of mainstream conservative voter, has a choice in this election, could perceive that they have a choice for this election, between a Benjamin Netanyahu 61 coalition beholden to Ben-Gvir and the far right, the extreme right, or a Lapid center-left leader beholden to Gideon Sa'ar and Naftali Bennett and therefore can't move too far to the left. In other words, they're voting sort of coalition rather than, and that's a reason to vote Sa'ar. Now, I am not advocating voting Sa'ar. I am explaining that you could be a voter for Lapid and Netanyahu and religious Zionism and Bennett and Sa'ar and Ra'am, and there are Jews voting for the joint list now, like that we haven't seen before, on these kinds of very complex tactics. So I'm done. Welcome to our chaos math.
It's some of it is inside baseball. Some of it is, I think, it's all extremely strategic. Thank you to both of you for taking us through all of that. And I think for those of us who are paying attention to the screen and listening to you as well, Aviv, it seems to revolve around either a pro or an anti-Netanyahu coalition. So, it does come down to this one man, this one prime minister, the longest serving in Israeli history. And I wonder sometimes if you consider the idea of, well, A, is the system broken, given the fact that you've both talked about the good possibility of going to a fifth election, and whether the country is at a place where they're ready to consider term limits.
So the issue with term limits is that we don't have direct elections in Israel. You vote for a party and not the prime minister. There was a brief period in the 90s where you voted for the prime minister, and then that was reversed because people were voting for prime ministers but not their parties, and the prime minister had no power base. So Israelis tried that and moved back. In any case, so now you vote for a party and not the prime minister, and each party has its own way of selecting its leader. In fact, I believe right now Likud is the only part, no, Likud and Meretz and Labor are the only parties that their leaders are chosen by primary. Don't get mad if there's some other party you're following and I missed it. But Likud is the only major party. It's the only party where a candidate could be considered, the leading candidate could be considered for prime minister, that has had an actual primary in which the leader is elected by tens of thousands of members of that party. The other possible candidates, mainly Yair Lapid, but let's say Naftali Bennett or Gideon Sa'ar, they're all self-appointed. So basically, the system in Israel doesn't lend itself to term limits because you're not doing a direct election. And I think there are other forms of electoral reform that might be more effective in that way, whether it's to actually require primaries, say for parties, maybe not on their first time running for but their second time. Or I don't actually think that would ever pass, though. It's not really practical. No party, none of these politicians are going to say, let me create a new threat to my own leadership. So yeah, but there is a lot of talk in the opposition. The Labor's leader, Merav Michaeli, she has proposed a bill more than once to have term limits. that someone cannot be a candidate, like the prime minister, for more than, I think, 2 terms, which, that could mean 6 months, considering how often we've had elections in the last 2 years. But I think that it would require a very big, sort of a major shift in the electoral system, and I just don't see it happening anytime soon.
Thank you. Aviv, did you want to weigh in on that question?
I just think the problem isn't necessarily the electoral system, in the sense that our parties really represent subcultures and tribes, so to speak, Haredim and secularists and Russian speakers and Arabs and various subcultures within the Arab community. And that's why our system works, because we are a very divided and sort of fractured society. The problem we're facing now is that the country itself is split down the middle, and the Knesset reflects that. So it's not enough to change the system. We really are at about, I don't know, divided 60-40 on Netanyahu, with about against Netanyahu, with about the 10% in the middle, around the Bennett area, preferring the right to the left, but not necessarily Netanyahu. So it's a reality reflected in polls and in society, and I don't know how you would change that reality with any reforms of the electoral system.
So can you drill down a little bit about why, I don't know, a quarter of the Israeli population, 25% of the electorate is still so solidly behind him? I mean, what is it about Netanyahu, after all these years in office, that continues to, inspire? I mean, the Israeli public continues to be in his thrall. Can you explain explain the popularity, I suppose, and we've talked a little bit about the problems that people have, his management of the coronavirus and so forth. But what continues to captivate Israelis about Netanyahu?
Lav?
Sure. Life is good in Israel. I mean, coronavirus is not great, but our economy has grown. We in the past 20 years or so, of which Netanyahu, has been prime minister for 12 and was finance minister for another 2. We went from a developing country to a highly developed country with a very successful economy. And people see it in their quality of life. Israel had its most peaceful year the last year, and some of that, I think, has to do with coronavirus and people not leaving their houses. But we've also had basically our most peaceful decade. And all of these things are very important to Israelis. So that's like a very macro view. The other thing is that there is a little bit of a culture war that's happening in Israel. It's sometimes oversimplified Ashkenazi Sephardi, and I don't think it's that simple, but again, to try to oversimplify it, there are people who are maybe, I don't have a good answer for what exactly the divide is, but there is a sort of populist appeal that Netanyahu has for people who feel like the system and the elites, and not only within Israel, the elites, like the historic elites of Israel, which are sort of left-wing Ashkenazim who live in the Tel Aviv area, but also the global sort of elites. And I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I mean, the UN that automatically votes against Israel, Europe, which on the one hand is our biggest trading partner, but on the other hand is very, very critical of us and still are sort of leading figures of the world, et cetera, et cetera. So people who sort of view all of these, I guess, elites as being against them, they have this sort of idea that Netanyahu stands up to these people. And it's not a wrong idea, right? He got up in front of Congress in 2015 and said to Obama, this is why we oppose the Iran deal. And he gets up in front of the UN and makes these speeches with his props, that everybody remembers. And people like that. People say, these people are criticizing us and Netanyahu is standing up for us. So I think all of these things together are a huge part of his appeal.
Thank you. And I want to remind everyone, we have some very good questions in the Q&A, but anybody who wants to get our attention should put that question into Q&A. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Haviv, can you talk about the reasons for why blue and white has disappeared. I mean, it captured about a quarter of the vote the last election, and I'm just curious to know what exactly happened.
Well, sometime around March 2020, when it was clear that the pandemic was something very serious and was about to arrive in Israel and had just begun to cause real worry, right around the election in March 2020. I think after 3 inconclusive races, facing a 4th inconclusive race, the possibility of a 4th inconclusive race, Benny Gantz made the decision. Benjamin Netanyahu came to Benny Gantz and he said to him, let's form a unity government. We now have this pandemic emergency. It's going to bring about a financial emergency. We already know what China's reaction is. We are seeing some of the fallout begin in Europe and places like Italy. We have to have a serious government in place. Benny Gantz said, the country comes before my own personal, political needs. And they agreed to form a unity government in March. Now, they then negotiated it and actually swore the government in May, and they created this strange rotation system, and they changed Israel's constitutional basic laws to allow for it. But already in March, the half of Blue and White, which was always an alliance of Benny Gantz's Israel Resilience Party, Yesh Atid of Yair Lapid, and a small party called Telem. Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid basically said to Gantz, Netanyahu has fooled you. Netanyahu has lied to you. Netanyahu is a very, very wily political operator. Some would say predatory even, and he's just literally lied to you. He is not going to form the kind of government that would take care of the pandemic, and in fact, you are never going to sit in the prime minister's chair in any rotation. The idea that you would think that this is true suggests you are not the kind of politician who was going to be prime minister anyway, and so it was a mistake to go with you in this alliance. And that alliance broke up then, and I think, unfortunately, for many of us, including Netanyahu supporters in many ways, and certainly for the last year, everyone who's been hurt by the government's handling of the pandemic, Yair Lapid turned out to have been right on that score.
Thank you. A question to both of you. There's a lot of questions in the chat about the influence of the Haredi parties and the reaction to the Haredim, their continuing grip, I guess, on as coalition kingmakers, the disdain I think that many in the country has had for the way that they didn't follow coronavirus guidelines and instructions, but is the role that they play in building, creating the new coalition going to be similar to the past, or how do you see that playing out in the next election?
So in recent years, more or less really for the last almost decade, really since 2015, I would say, the Haredim have been in Netanyahu's pocket. Now, Netanyahu needs them, actually, and they need him. But the Haredi street, the Haredi voter, has become over the years more and more right-wing. It used to be that the ultra could join a left-wing coalition, could join a right-wing coalition, and maybe one day it'll go back to that. Or maybe if Netanyahu loses big time this time, which I do not think will happen, but let's say, then maybe they'd go back to it. But overall, Haredim have become very right-wing, so much so that Shas in the first 2019 election, their election campaign was Bibi needs a strong Aryeh, like the strong Aryeh Deri, the head of Shas. So they feature Netanyahu in Shas ads so that people know that they're getting sort of 2 for the price of 1. And Netanyahu, really depends on the ultra-Orthodox parties because they are very loyal. And this was true also, back when they were in left-wing parties, where more or less they would go with what the government wants to do until it gets to their sort of key issues. Religion and state, certain sort of social issues, because they're very socially conservative, and they want to continue to not have to serve in the IDF. More or less, and they want funding for their institutions, but honestly, funding for your own institutions is endemic to Israeli politics, and the Haredim are particularly successful at it, but they're not the only ones. So, I think that they're going to continue to serve the same role that they have served for, much of the past decade, where Netanyahu leans on them and they need to lean on Netanyahu. They have this symbiotic relationship. And if Netanyahu can form a coalition, it will be with them.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the next one to Haviv, and actually this is a question from our audience, and it refers to the screen that you showed us about the breakdown, or what it looks like 8 days out. So Haviv, in previous polls, Ram, the Islamist Arab party, was below the threshold. Meretz was above it. In your poll, it was the reverse. So how close is it for each of these parties to being in or out? And I would also add, just to combine the question about labor, where do you, it's extraordinary to those of us who followed Israeli politics for the last 30 years to see, the numbers so slim. In low single digits. How do you see that playing out?
I think, this race will be decided on the edges, right, in those parties. So these are very significant questions. The short answer is there are populations that are, everything I said about the Israeli voter. The Israeli voter is hard to poll because the Israeli voter is so affected by polling and so tactical, which isn't true, for example, in the United States, where voters tend to lean one way or the other as sort of vast culture war questions, and where you live changes that. And we could it's pretty dependable, not always, not everywhere, but it's pretty dependable. So in Israel, people will switch parties very dramatically. Double-digit percentages will switch parties based on what the polls say. We've seen on the Ram question, for example, there's another layer of complexity. Ram represents maybe the most marginalized community in Israel, which is the Bedouin, who are very socially conservative, religiously conservative, and they're very hard to poll. They're just literally physically hard to talk to, and there's an expertise in getting and talking to them. Ram tends to deliver much, much more, 30% more, sometimes more than that, voters at the polling booth than in the polls. And so if Ram gets close to the threshold, most pollsters think it'll probably pass the threshold, but it has hovered up above and below. Meretz has hovered above and below. And by the way, a couple of recent polls, it's been comfortably above by an entire percentage point, which is not comfortably above, but 30% more than it needs, or 20% more than it needs. Those are where the decision of the election is likely to be made, in those small parties. The Labour Party is a fascinating story. Labour stopped being believable. Every Labour leader in recent memory has tried to use, since Ehud Barak in 2009, who went into the Netanyahu government, became Netanyahu's defense minister, and then 2 years in 2011, when Labour wanted him to pull out, Barak left Labour and formed the Independence Party, right? That stayed just in order to stay in. And so Labour became this vehicle for politicians to support Netanyahu and join Netanyahu, and it just became untenable for this party to still draw center-left, left-wing voters. Merav Michaeli resuscitated the party on this question, because she has spent the last year, even though her three Knesset member party went with Benny Gantz into the unity government, and 2 of them were appointed ministers, and she was offered a ministry herself, she actually refused and remained in opposition within the coalition. And people believe her that she won't sit with Netanyahu again, and that brought 7 seats back. So by the way, it brought 7 seats back entirely at the expense of other anti-Netanyahu parties, like Ron Choldei's, the Israelis, and others, which we don't have to get into. But so the camps haven't expanded or shrunk, but Labour itself has become more believable under Michaeli.
Okay. All right. So a couple of, I think we have time for a couple more questions, and they're, I think, more philosophical questions that we as Americans are deeply and profoundly interested in. What do you think are the long-term implications for democracy in Israel, having to go through so many elections? And I'll combine that with another question that I saw in the Q&A from a couple of people. I mean, I doubt that Israelis are very concerned about what Americans think, but is that a consideration, considering the importance of the U.S.-Israel relationship? So again, a two-parter: the long-term implications for democracy, and the implications as Israel perhaps takes a path that may be one that American Jews, not all American Jews certainly, but there are new tensions within our country as well, that many American Jews may not think is a healthy one, and is their concern for the future of Israel's relationship with American Jewry, and of course the strength of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Big question.
Israelis, like the average Israeli, the Israeli that you're not going to meet when you're less likely to meet when you're on your, organization's mission to Israel. The Israeli who runs the falafel shop on the corner or whatever does not think about American Jews unless one is coming to buy falafel from him. They just have no concept. They don't think about it. They don't know what American Jewish life is like. They don't really know what diaspora Jewish life is like, at least not contemporary diaspora Jewish life. They might have heard about, what their parents' or grandparents' life had been like. It's just not something that the average Israeli thinks about. And that to some extent is reflected in the Knesset. There are some organizations that try to bring Israeli Knesset members to go and meet Jewish American Jews, and from all different denominations. And I think that they do have an effect. I've heard from Knesset members, that they've really learned a lot and that they've learned to be more sensitive. But overall, other than, people want to welcome immigrants generally, Jewish olim. I think people have a positive feeling about Aliyah. Israelis just don't really think about the diaspora that much. Now, there's a different level to the shift, which is on a government level, and how do the prime minister and the president get along? What are the things that the Biden administration is doing that will or will not impact Israel? I think under normal circumstances, that is important to people, at least from it's top of the hour on the news kind of important to people, or towards the top of the hour. But I have to say that in the year of COVID, it's a lot important. It's just anything that's not COVID is relegated to at least 15 to 20 minutes in. Even in this election cycle, election news is very rarely top of the news. And so I think that, if we weren't in a pandemic, there would probably be a lot more sort of news about, like how do the Obama alumni in the White House feel about Netanyahu, and is this going to impact our relations? And I could tell you, like, I work at, for me, that's big news. That's what I write about, and it gets to the front page of the Jerusalem Post, and I'm sure it gets highlighted in the Times of Israel too, because we have people who speak English. We write in English. But I watch, the news at 8 every night, and I read the Israeli press, and those things do not get the kind of attention that they normally would have. Although I think maybe when the pandemic ends, people will care about that a little more.
Thank you. Thanks, Lahav. Haviv, any final comments, particularly about the big question of the future of Israeli democracy as we contemplate the very likely possibility that Israel will head into a fifth election in the coming months, and any last words about the way you see the relationship between the Israeli administration, the future Israeli administration, the future prime minister, and the new president in the United States?
Yeah, I want to take a very, very optimistic line, with apologies for Jews should not be taking optimistic sort of direction, but it's in defiance of my culture and thousands of years of tradition, I'm going to do so. President Obama said something that I thought was very poignant, and I thought was very wrong, but it was wrong for good reasons. He said a few years ago. Israel needs to, recall and hark back to its liberal tradition in the eras of, Golda Meir and Levi Eshkol, and bring that tradition forward, and not, veer right, as we're seeing many parts of the world. I'm obviously paraphrasing him. He said it better. As we're seeing in many parts of the world, this kind of veering rightward. And I think he said it very authentically, and I think it reflected the American Jewish conversation that he's very, very plugged into and knows well. And I, as an Israeli, was startled by those comments. And I was startled by those comments because the Israel was a much, much, much less liberal Israel. And for many, many minorities, including Jewish minorities, certainly for the Arab community, was much less democratic and much less accessible and much less open. There isn't that you can bring, even in the question of the West Bank and Palestinians, where the discussion with Israel, if you compare, certain trends in the West Bank to the 90s, then we're all very disappointed. But if you compare questions of Arab integration and openness and accessibility in every facet of life, Israel has grown more liberal on questions of gay rights and on questions of minorities and all of those issues. Israeli democracy is strong. Israeli democracy is a little bit miraculous. We're not American Jews. We come from places like Yemen and Tsarist Russia. Almost no Israeli came to Israel with any experience of democracy. And this thing has survived wars and economic crises and all of that. So I'm very bullish on the prospect, even if our discourse sometimes we remember the 60s in a certain way, and we think it's no longer that, but it might be a trick of memory rather than Israel itself not improving over the years. And I think that, of course, has implications for the future relationship. Israelis aren't aware of the relationship, exactly like Lahab said, and that's a big shame. The vast, vast majority of Israeli school children and Israeli college students can go through 16 years of education, of public education in this country, without actually encountering a single class hour on living diasporas. They learn about dead diasporas, that's their history classes, but they don't ever learn about American Jews. If I have one message to American Jews, come to Israel and invest in the education system in a curriculum on American Jews, you're the other half of the Jewish people, and Israelis just literally don't learn about you at all. So that's something that we need to tackle at a strategic level, not just in the media conversation, but I think it's very much missing. I don't think Israelis are aware of it at all.
Well, on that note, which I think
if I could just add something.
Certainly will.
Oh.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, Koviv was talking about the sort of how a certain segment of Israelis and also diaspora Jews are sort of nostalgic for Israel of the 60s and the kibbutzim and Golda Meir, et cetera. This sort of ties into the answer I gave before about like, why does Netanyahu have so much staying power? Because while a lot of people are nostalgic for all those things I just mentioned from Israel of decades and decades ago, many Likud voters in that time, their parents had just immigrated from Morocco or from Iran or wherever, and their culture was seen as inferior to the culture of people like Golda Meir and Ben Gurion and whoever who came from Russia. Golda Meir, Russia by way of Milwaukee, but still Russia. Their culture was sort of suppressed. Many of them were sent to live in towns that basically didn't exist. They had to build their own towns far away from Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, where the economic opportunities were. And these are people who saw themselves as oppressed by the dominant culture. And I mean, that's what Chavi was referring to with Jewish minorities. And Menachem Begin, the founding leader of Likud, was seen and justifiably as a champion of these people. He really invested a lot in what were called development towns to sort of catch them up to other parts of Israel. Likud had Sephardic, Mizrahi people in senior positions in the party, and they allowed people like that to form branches of Likud in their local towns. You're probably thinking Menachem Begin became prime minister in 1977. Why is this relevant today? But I even see people in their 30s who say, my parents say that when Likud came to power, we felt we got our dignity back. And it is amazing to me, as someone who wasn't even alive then, but also who came to Israel 16 years ago, how much power that narrative has and that history has for so many Israelis. So that's sort of, because it's a long backstory to explain, I didn't mention it before, but that's a huge part of why Netanyahu wins.
Right. Can I just continue? Just Netanyahu wins a landslide among Mizrahim, and Yair Lapid his constituents are overwhelmingly Ashkenazi. And it's, as Lav said, it's too simple to just say it's some kind of a Mizrahi Ashkenazi, but I mean, we're talking 70-30 landslides. Again, educated, guess from past polls, not that that's exactly something polled just now. I mean, it's exactly that. That has tremendous power, and they're not voting on the economy. We don't have culture wars in Israel about healthcare or abortions. That's a big part of it, and it's invisible, essentially in the English discourse about Israel. I think, including in the Times of Israel, it's something that we don't talk about constantly because it's not part of our experience, but it's a very big part of what's happening.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you. With all the complications, I think that that big question about looking to the future, in spite of the idea that there may even be a fifth election on the horizon, a lot to be thankful for, a lot to be positive about. As we here in the United States and across the world contemplate coming back to Israel, we know already that you're ready for us. It may be a little while before we're ready to come to you, but we do look forward in the not too distant future, perhaps as soon as this summer, to be visiting and to be seeing and meeting you in person one day, and to be talking about this face-to-face rather than on Zoom, with all of its connectivity issues sometimes and transcribing issues, which we've learned that Israeli names don't translate so well on the screen. But it was great to be able to transcribe this conversation as well. Thank you to both of you. And of course to JCPA for hosting this. I want to remind everybody, JCPA's annual conference, April 25th and 26th. Till then and afterwards, everybody be well, stay safe, and thank you all for joining us. Have a good day.